Hello, good morning, good afternoon. I'm Shauna Bader-Blau. I am a board member of the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, and I'm also the executive director of the Solidarity Center. On behalf of the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, welcome to the Mary Robinson Speaker Series. And right off the bat, let me share that Mary sends her regrets. She can't be here in person, but she did record a video welcome, which I will introduce now. Many of you know Mary Robinson as the former President of Ireland, the former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. Mary Robinson is also a champion of making sure that human rights are at the core of business. She is the chair of the Business and Human Rights Resource Center's Strategic Advisory Group, and she advises us routinely on strategy, like how to put the just transition to clean energy at the center of all of our work. She advises us on the just management of the pandemic. She's a great champion of human rights defenders and of women in particular. She's a fantastic spokesperson for the cause. When Mary first agreed to do this annual lecture series, she insisted that these events always center the most marginalized and exploited in our world so that we can together through this series amplify their voices and speak to their struggles. And today is no exception. Please enjoy the short video welcome from Mary, and we'll return back after that for the panel discussion.
Thank you to the Business and Human Rights Resource Center for hosting this event every year, and to all of you for joining us. I'm so sorry that at the very last minute, a diary clash prevents me from joining you this year. As you know, this is our second virtual speaker series, and even though we're not able to be together in person at our usual venue in Roosevelt House during the UN General Assembly Week, I know we can look forward to lively discussion as we explore this timely and thought-provoking area. You also know that COVID-19, the pandemic, has upended all our lives and threatened the health and well-being of nearly everyone on the planet. It hasn't impacted everyone equally, of course, but it has changed how we live. And it has also put workers' rights firmly on the agenda. You'll recall that for last year's speaker series, we looked at one group who had collectively faced the most severe impacts, garment workers at the bottom of the global supply chains. We explored together how the pandemic has exposed and exacerbated the deep inequalities that existed between companies and workers. And this fed into the work so many of us are engaged with, seeking to hold fashion companies and brands to account, looking towards a post-pandemic future which respects workers, provides fair wages and decent working conditions. A year later, our broad movement is still wrestling with the devastating impacts of the pandemic and the endemic abuse of supply chain workers. One of the most visible of these are gig workers, the people all over the world working through digital platform apps as couriers, as delivery workers, and as drivers for companies that have quickly become household names. These companies have fundamentally changed the world of work and redefined what forms of justice workers are collectively struggling for, and how to shape the gig economy so that it respects the rights of workers. Our panelists today, Bama, Ruwan, Thulsi, and Vaidehee, are exceptionally well placed to speak to us about the challenges facing gig workers and to explore whether the current rights framework is fit for purpose for these workers, from challenging Uber's misclassification of workers through courts to grappling with digital rights for workers today. They will discuss how we will all need to change, to adapt, to get ready for the future of work. I must say, I always love to engage with the frontline workers, frontline defenders, basically, who take part every year in these events. It's on different subject areas. It's on gig workers this year, but each time I feel inspired by the interaction. And I'm going to miss that this year, but you'll be able to hear what they have to say and really benefit from it. This intersection between labor and digital rights is underexplored, considering the speed with which the gig economy sector has grown in recent years. Direct action by workers themselves, challenging poor conditions and treatment, has forced the hand of platforms, encouraging responsive governments to regulate and resulted in some baseline requirements. Yet these seem to remain piecemeal at present. And of course, the responsibility for creating a rights protecting framework shouldn't fall to those toiling within a deeply flawed system. So today, the discussion will explore how a labour rights framework for gig workers is critical if we want to ensure our road to a post-pandemic recovery ends in justice for working people. Our speakers will examine effective approaches from different angles, including enhancing workers' power, investor action, enhanced norms and legislative frameworks. For instance, a current momentum towards effective human rights due diligence laws, for which we owe so much to the late John Ruggie, the late and much lamented John Ruggie, that could help strengthen the system and better protect gig economy worker rights. I hope we'll use this as a moment to reimagine and rebuild a global economy that serves and respects the rights of all. As I say, I'm disappointed to be missing the rich discussion, but know I'm leaving you in capable and wise hands. I look forward to catching up on the discussion and hearing from our speakers what this new economy could and should look like. Thank you and enjoy the event.
Thank you to Mary Robinson. We're going to miss her today and her amazing leadership. If we could have more leaders, elected leaders and officials around the world who echo the words labor rights and justice, the world will be a better place tomorrow coming out of the pandemic. Thank you to Mary for her leadership. So we're going to get started. In a minute, I'm going to go over the agenda. I first wanted to let you know that we have a poll that we want to share. So if we could tee up the poll now. And while you're looking at this poll, I'm going to run through the program. So the poll is asking, in the last 12 months, have you ordered food via delivery app or traveled with a ride-hail app? All right, so while you're answering, let me run quickly through the program. We are going to have a fantastic panel of 4 amazing, brilliant speakers. I will ask them some questions and then we will have an audience Q&A. I should let attendees know, do not use the raise hand function when you would like to ask a question. Please instead insert your question, just pop it right into the Q&A box. We will monitor that and get to those questions. So thank you for that. I also wanted to let everyone know that you are encouraged to tweet during this event. We will be live tweeting ourselves using the hashtag BHR Speaker Series. That's hashtag BHR Speaker Series. This event is being live streamed and recorded. All right, so let's see what y'all said in response to the poll. Can we see the responses, please? All right, 80% of us have ordered food via delivery app or traveled with a ride-hail app. Okay, so that means we have a room full of experts on how the gig economy works and what it's all about. That's getting us started. All right, thank you for that, everyone. So many of you have answered yes to that question. And now we're gonna ask you another poll question. And please answer this one honestly. If we could tee up the next poll question, please. All right, if you answered yes to the last question, which of the following best describes your role when using that platform? Client, employer, or product? So, even if you answered no, we do want you to respond to this with your best guess or thought about that. All right, so while you're thinking through this question, I'm going to begin to introduce a fantastic first panelist. I would like to introduce you to my sister, Bama. Bama is an expert on international labor issues, on gender and social inclusion, on business and human rights, and has an enormous amount of knowledge and information and studying and thinking about the gig economy and its impact on labor markets and the labor force. She also runs an amazing podcast called the Gig Podcast, which I completely encourage everyone. I highly recommend that y'all listen to it. This doesn't explain Bama well enough. She is equal parts grassroots activist and thought leader and policy analyst. And so we couldn't be happier than to have Bama join us today. So why don't we see the answer to this question before we get into the questions for Bama? Could we see the response?
Actually, before we do that, Shauna, I was going to ask you how you responded to the question.
Yeah, okay.
And it's fine. So everyone can see the answers. We're going to talk about this. But Shauna, what did you say?
All right. We have ordered a lot of food during the pandemic. And, I know that I view myself as a client of the restaurant, right? I mean, if I'm being really honest, when a driver comes to the door, a delivery driver, we always tip. We understand that that's a really important part of how they gain wages in this economy. But if I'm being really honest, I really think of myself as the client of the restaurant,
Well, it looks like most people who answered the question agree with you. But I have a different view.
Well, I am curious about your view. So thank you for that poll. We all view ourselves as clients. And then thank you, Bama, for that. And, most of us view ourselves as clients, but what do you think, Bama? Are we actually employers? And what does that even mean, products? Tell me more about that.
Great. Well, so first, let me say hello to everyone. Thank you so much for joining the discussion today and taking time to listen to us. I hope you find it interesting. And Shauna, thanks to you for that lovely introduction. And of course, thanks to BHRRC. We're so pleased that to see the theme for this year's event. And it's so great to see the resources that BHRRC continues to put out on this and other sectors. So now that I've said that, let me get into the conversation with you. We are the product. We are all the product. I have said, and I want to say for this audience, that we are now beyond the age of a globalizing economy. We're no longer globalizing. We're a digitizing economy, right? So the next wave of globalization is actually digitization. And as some have said, data is the new oil. It's the data that we all share that makes this new digitized economy work. Here's an image that can help you think a little bit about how that works, and I'll explain. Oh gosh, this worked so well when I did it in the test, and now it doesn't. So let me not do that. I will tell you what, there you go. You can see the image. Now, Shauna, have you ever watched the Harry Potter movies?
14 times.
Right. So for anybody on this webinar that has watched the Harry Potter movies, this is a Dementor. And what it does is it sucks out your soul, right? So right now it's sucking out Harry's soul. This is the metaphor that I think really explains what happens when you get on that app and order food, or order a ride, or order a task. You get on one of those apps like Handy and order someone to come over and help do something, fix your furniture. You're providing data to that platform. And it's that information that is actually what the platform is monetizing and making money off of. And so they need to keep extracting this data from all of us in order to do what they really want to do, what the business model really is set up to do. What is that? The business model is set up to disrupt markets by harnessing big data sets, using predictive analytics, and then really trying to capture entire markets like transportation markets. So we are all collectively providing that resource, and that is something that some people have theorized and called data labor. And what that means is, like, every time you even like click on a link and like something, right? Click a like, you're providing a little teeny tiny bit of data labor into the platform, whether it's a social media platform or anything else. And that's part of what that platform needs to continue to be successful and to make money. I think, the only other point I want to make on this is that from a point of view of workers and how workers experience platforms, that those predictive analytics are used to do some nudging and some things that I guess we're going to get into in a minute that control how workers actually do their work. And that's what we really need to be concerned about. But on the bigger picture of this data economy, this matters to all of us because there's been some really good work done by digital rights advocates on privacy, but it's not just about privacy. We collectively need to think about this tragedy of the commons, which is the production of this resource that's being sucked up worldwide and is fueling these giant corporations, and that we receive very little benefit from. Back to you, Shauna.
So from now on, whenever I like something on Facebook or Twitter, I'm going to imagine that Dementor sucking out the soul.
It's kind of like this. I'm going to do another image just for fun because these are fun. This is where we live today. Who recognizes that movie image? Shauna, tell me you watched that one when you were a kid.
Not 14.
Right, it's the Matrix. Yeah, we all are kind of living in the Matrix.
Well, so let me ask a couple of follow-up questions just briefly. I mean, at the Solidarity Center, we work globally in 60 countries around the world directly with workers. We've seen this sector, particularly digital platform delivery, apps and work just proliferate across every continent. And we see this, these jobs, all over the world as often like low wage, unsafe, precarious. It hasn't been the creation of a bunch of decent work. It's been the creation of a lot of, short-term temporary contract and insecure work is what we're seeing around the world. And, so I just want to ask, like, what's new about that, right? Like, so,
Yeah.
I've heard you say before, talk about precarious work. What's new about this kind of work? And can you dig in a little bit more about what it means for workers that, like, digitalization of the economy and the use of all of our data, what does it actually mean in changing the nature of work?
The thing that most frightens me is that what it means, even for these super marginalized individual workers, is that we're seeing new forms of control. Mm-hmm. And I know that in our audience, we doubtless have a lot of people who've worked on human trafficking. And one of the things that I would say is that our old frameworks for dealing with things like human trafficking are no longer fit for purpose. Why is that? Because we are seeing new forms of force, fraud, and coercion that are a result of algorithmic manipulation. All right, now I know that was a big term just there, so let me just explain a little bit what I mean. What does that look like? How does that work, right? What do you mean algorithmic manipulation? Okay, so let's say you are a tuk-tuk driver, right, in Thailand or Cambodia, and you're now getting your rides from an app. Just give you one example of how this algorithmic manipulation might play out. And I'm going to do that by actually putting a little link in the chat for all of you that you can do if you want to. And it is going to be asking you to rate me as a speaker, right? Okay, that's a rating of 1 to 5. This is really common. We see on a lot of platforms these rating systems, where you're the client, supposedly, right? You put in 1 star through 5 stars. How'd you like your ride? All right, so let me explain that, while people are rating me. Now, people are rating me. I'm going to give you a second and pause for 30 seconds. How am I doing as a speaker, 1 through 5? Okay, now I'm going to tell you something, and that is, how does it make you feel to know that if you all collectively rated me anything lower than a 4.8, I am going to get deactivated? What does that mean, deactivated? That means I'm going to get thrown out before the Q&A session and won't be around for Q&A, because the collective rating and the algorithm shows that I'm not a good enough speaker to continue to be part of this session. That's the situation. That's the phenomenon that your tuk-tuk driver is facing. If they get ratings that drop below a certain level, and it's often quite high, something like 4.8 out of 5, the platform deactivates them, and they cannot do anything about it because it's an algorithm. It's a piece of code that's made that decision. Now, let me bring this back and loop it back to what I said about force, fraud, and coercion. What happens in reality, and I know this, both from other people, lots of other good people are doing, great research on this topic and really systematically showing this, and also from my own interviews with, particularly with ride-hailing drivers around the world. What actually happens is that they know perfectly well that customers are inevitably likely to rate male drivers higher than female drivers. Your rating is just going to be lower if you're a woman driver. That's just the way it is. You're much more likely to fall below that 4.8. They're going to be higher for high status individuals if you're in a country where that means race, that you're going to get rated higher than somebody who's a person of color. It's a known thing that individual data sets are reinforcing discrimination that then play out in ways that affect these workers. The other thing that's really important to know is that, and here's where the coercion effect comes in, no matter what happens in the back of that tuk-tuk, the driver has every incentive to just put up with it. He's asked to go, or she is asked to go, a little extra distance. They're asked to go out of their way. They're asked to, to perhaps endure things, harassment, verbal harassment that are really hard for them. They nevertheless are coerced into wanting that 5-star rating because they know their livelihood may depend on it. And so on other types of platforms, again, the more precarious the worker, the more likely they are to put up with quite abusive behavior in order to maintain their rating on the platform. So that's just one example. There's some other little tricks and tricks of the trade as well. But what we are seeing is absolutely a new set of forms of coercion that affect very low wage, very precarious workers. There's a really fabulous set of researchers at Data and Society, and they've done some work with domestic workers on this. Domestic workers that, maybe in situations where they're putting up with sexual harassment, because they don't have anything but the algorithm, right? So I could go on, but I think I've taken enough time on this. So let me go back to you, Shauna.
You've painted a really illuminating picture of both, classic forms of coercion that workers have faced across history, but with an added dimension of how the digital economy and digitalization is adding another layer, coercion by algorithm. With that painted picture of what it's like to be a worker in the gig economy, it's a good time to transition to my brother, Ruwan. I'd like to introduce Ruwan now. Ruwan is joining us from Canada today. He is the legal director at the International Transport Federation, ITF, which is a global union. And he represents the ITF at both the International Labor Organization and the OECD. He also is heavily engaged in this sector and the legal and governance issues of gig economy companies. And since we are today on Twitter and social media using the hashtag BHR Speaker Series, I would point out that Ruwan has an absolutely awesome Twitter feed. So please follow Ruwan on Twitter. So Ruwan, Bama just painted a picture of what it's like, increasingly like for workers in this sector. There's been a lot of global news coverage about how workers are challenging the proliferation of poor working conditions in the sector, both through the courts, but also through strikes and other organizing and job actions around the world. Can you talk a little bit from your vantage point about what you've been seeing about activism in this sector and how people are challenging and pushing back?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you, Shauna. Good day to everyone. Thanks so much for the invitation, and thanks also to the Resource Center and Mary Robinson for organizing this event for the business and human rights community. I think it's perhaps important to say at the outset that platform work in one way or another features in pretty much every product and service supply chain in the world. So it's about time that this community also gets heavily engaged on this issue. I mean, perhaps just to start, and Bama really introduced this so eloquently and perfectly, is the idea that work in this space, of course, is based on the dehumanization of workers. Just look at the narrative that the platforms try to paint, right? It's anything but work. We talk about gigs, tasks, rides, drop-offs, all while these workers are being called partners of these platforms in a not so sharing economy. So that's the starting point. So I really liked, Shauna, what you said about algorithmic coercion. I think we need to go beyond talking about algorithmic management and talk about algorithmic coercion, which is basically what these workers are subject to. And I want to get into discussing what I think have been very successful strategies on tackling these platforms, which are based on sort of a three-pronged strategy. So that is organizing, legal, and political. And however, before we do that, I think it's also important to look at some of the hidden aspects of this employment model, right? So I think when we order a food or take a vehicle from a ride-hail app, we don't necessarily realize that there's so many hidden costs, right? That these workers are subject to. Workers have to pay for the cars, bicycles, phones, pay for the fuel, maintenance, etc. For some of these food delivery apps, they actually have to pay an onboarding fee and even pay for those, those ubiquitous sort of cargo boxes in the back of their bikes. They've got to pay for them themselves, right? We've heard about pay, piece rate pay, etc. And all of this is built on employment status misclassification. And I suppose for friends on the call that don't really know what this means, I mean, this is basically the platforms holding out that these workers are independent contractors or self-employed, and therefore they can completely abrogate the employment responsibilities, right? But the proper classification of workers, of course, is extremely important, because without it, workers may not be entitled to minimum pay rates, overtime pay, paid leave, but also the fundamental rights of freedom of association and collective bargaining. And I think what we've seen through the pandemic is really all of these issues coming to the fore. Ride-hail drivers, food delivery workers being considered essential workers, yet not being provided PPE, personal protective equipment. So those of us who had the fortune of staying at home and ordering our food to avoid the virus were relying on workers picking up and delivering food without adequate PPE. Just think about that contrast. It's absolutely shocking. So in terms of organizing, and we've been involved in this space for about 6 or 7 years, I think it's important to note that there's a stat from an OECD study last year that said that workers in non-standard forms of employment, including disguised employment relationships, are 50% less likely to be unionized than standard workers, 50% less likely. In some jurisdictions, workers can't even join trade unions for the purpose of collective bargaining because they're not considered workers or employees. Mm-hmm. So the response, I think, has bun twofold. So we've had your incumbent or traditional unions making outreach efforts, restructuring internally to allow non-standard workers to join, developing new organizing tools to deal with this very atomized workforce, as it were. And many of our affiliates have been doing that. But what I think is really extraordinary is the development of alternative organizing efforts, right? So it's the formation of new independent unions made up of non-standard workers, really rooted in community and worker empowerment. And this has been really wonderful to see. And I've got a few pictures here to share with everyone, hoping that everyone can see these. These are pictures of actions around the world taken by gig workers, right? And although the right to strike is a human right, we need to consider when we look at these pictures that for these very vulnerable workers, as Bama said earlier, gig workforce is made up of migrant workers, workers of color, and others. Without the protection of the law, they can, of course, face significant reprisals. So when we look at these pictures, I think we really need to bear that in mind. And what these pictures show also is collective action across the world. I mean, there's pictures here from Thailand, Nigeria, Italy, to the UK, and parts of Latin America. And one really good example from one of the pictures coming up now is a big day of action against a platform called eFood in Greece. And this just happened a couple of weeks ago. And following this strike, which also led to consumer action, the food delivery platform agreed to directly hire these riders, right? And eFood is a subsidiary of Delivery Hero, a major food delivery platform operating around the world. So once again, I think it shows that worker power and strikes do work, and that in this space, it's very important. And on the organizing piece, I think we also need to say that it's what's been a real boon for gig workers are the achievement of collective bargaining agreements. In some countries like Italy, where Just Eat reached a CBA with the three major transport union federations incorporating the national sectoral agreement. The same happened in Denmark with the same platform. In Sweden, we have a CBA with Foodora, in Norway as well. And what these agreements show fundamentally is that this false dichotomy of flexibility versus employment rights is completely false. That collective agreements can pave the way for proper, decent standards based on flexible work and workers' rights. So I would say that those are some key achievements in the organizing space. And perhaps maybe I can come back a little later on talking about some of the core legal strategies that unions have been using.
Oh, great. And, when I was looking at those pictures and thinking about the discussion so far, really in the labor movement, we say 150 years of human history has really established the right to freedom of association, the right to strike, and collective bargaining as the core human rights of workers, and that applies equally to this sector as it does to every other one. I think you illustrated that really powerfully. I wonder if we could take a step back for a second. And I want to introduce my sister Thulsi from the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. Thulsi is the head of labor rights at the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, and she's our activist and thought leader in this field. And she does a ton of work on freedom of association, living wages, forced labor for the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. And so I just want to pass it over to you, Thulsi. The Resource Center looks specifically at global supply chains. That's a big focus of our work, and the structural issues that perpetuate inequalities between workers and companies. So if we take a step back and we listen to what Bama described as the trends and Ruwan described as the working conditions and the pushback. If we take a step back, how do gig workers fit into your work?
Thanks, Shauna, and hi everyone. It's so lovely to join all of you today, and especially to be on a panel with these amazing people. So to answer your question, Shauna, in terms of how it fits into our work, I mean, it's increasingly become a really inescapable focus for our work, and you will see that from just the number of stories that we're collecting around the incredible organizing that Ruwan has spoken about, and the incredible power of this very small number of companies that are operating in so many different countries, around the world. But I just want to kind of focus for the purposes of today on maybe two ways that gig workers have fit into our work, looking at the structural abuses in global supply chains. As many of you will know, a lot of the work that we do at the Resource Center has focused on the apparel industry, but it's important to kind of consider that we see the work on the apparel industry is ultimately kind of illustrative of broader trends when it comes to the erosion of worker rights and the kind of ultimate precarity of those workers. And I do want to say, you know, I think we're talking about gig economy workers here, but, you know, for global South workers all around the world, you know, they have faced informality and precarity and, you know, the fact that they simply haven't been classified as direct employees for a long time. So, you know, I just want to kind of flag that, you know, it's amazing now to have, you know, a really international focus on gig economy workers to understand and be able to really articulate what some of these kind of factors are that Ruwan just mentioned around the erosion of rights, things like the erosion of freedom of association and collective bargaining, the huge impacts, the use of police power against those workers. So I just wanted to kind of say that it's important to have that global South perspective. I'm very aware that we're all at the moment sitting in global North countries. So just to kind of talk us through how we arrived kind of internally actually at this focus on gig economy workers. You know, what has happened during the pandemic for apparel workers is really evident, but we were also forced to kind of confront another shift within, for example, the apparel industry. So the huge spike in where and how people buy clothes has really changed. We're now seeing, for example, in the United States, online apparel sales are accounting for at least 50% of total apparel purchases right now. And obviously that's mirrored in a lot of places around the world. So what does that mean? It of course means that there's a corresponding spike in warehouse and delivery workers that are working, you know, under the kinds of conditions of gig economy workers, but that they're critical parts of the apparel supply chain. When we talk about the apparel supply chain, we spend a lot of our time talking about garment workers in factories, primarily in the global South, but obviously warehouse and delivery workers are now forming an incredible and important part of the apparel supply chain. And that can be applied to agricultural supply chains and, you know, a lot of different things like that. Another kind of key shift to consider is where people are buying clothes and how that's changed during the pandemic. Amazon is now the #1 clothing retailer in the United States, and it's continued to cement its kind of e-commerce dominance in this space. And so, you know, while we've talked a little bit today about kind of food up delivery workers and ride hail workers, the kind of delivery workers for companies like Amazon, and we have to remember they've crossed the 1 million worker threshold now around the world. So they're a huge kind of, you know, a real way for us, I think, to kind of understand what this global economic model means in terms of having that dominance, what that means for their ability to kind of employ a huge number of workers without actually taking responsibility or having any liability for them, and then the incredible governance gap that ultimately then exists when it comes to really being able to hold companies like Amazon, as well as some of the other companies we've discussed today, accountable. So I'll come back to the liability issue shortly, but I do want to just kind of reiterate the point that Ruwan made about the capacity for organizing then because of the global dominance of some of these companies. Going back to Amazon, the Make Amazon Pay campaign saw garment workers, you know, kind of taking to the streets at the same time as warehouse workers and delivery workers in countries like Mexico and Colombia and Germany and the UK at the same time. And that possibility of global worker solidarity, I think, is immense and something that's really exciting for us at the Resource Center. But going back to that kind of governance gap and that real difficulty with holding these companies liable, you know, we've already talked about the misclassification of workers, so I probably won't kind of cover that again. But there are a number of other ways that the liability question has come up for us at the Resource Center. We've had a big focus on mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence, because for us as an organization, it's really critical to consider whether or not the voluntary regulations that we've had to date work. And I guess that's an easy answer. It's a resounding no. And so, you know, this is just one way we think that's really critical to be able to ensure that companies are held liable for the rights abuses that occur for their workers. But what does that mean for gig economy workers? And is the MHRDD model something that's going to be fit for gig economy workers, as well as supply chain workers like garment workers or tea plantation workers, is something that's of real importance to us, because we're all putting, I think, collectively a lot of focus on these forms of regulation, and we really want to make sure that they're actually going to be making the difference that we want to see. So just two of the things that we want to make sure that we're considering when it comes to MHRDD and gig economy workers is to ensure that a living wage is something that is kind of considered under these laws. It's still one of those things that has a sense of ambiguity around it and ought not to. It's not ambiguous at all. It's very clearly a fundamental human right. And it's a cornerstone of decent work and building these fundamental dignities for people as workers. Yet there are concerns that the scope of MHRDD laws won't extend to them. And what we really want to see is when companies are in a position where they're held liable, directly liable, or at least jointly liable for when the non-payment of minimum wages happen. And that's, you know, that's as relevant to someone working in a garment factory as it is to a gig economy worker where, you know, they're working, you know, for ridiculous hourly wages. I think, you know, the other thing that we're really looking at when it comes to human rights due diligence is what kind of loopholes, what other kinds of loopholes exist. And I think I would go through a few more, but I'm aware of time and I want to make sure that we get to Vaidehee, so I'm actually not going to kind of cover them. But I just want to kind of end by saying, you know, on our website, we've just collected an extraordinary number of allegations of abuse internationally against such a small number of companies ultimately. But alongside that, the huge number of stories we've got around the resistance, you know, these new forms of organizing that are taking place all over the world, I think give us real cause for being excited about deepening our relationship with this vital movement. But, you know, I think central to what we do going forward really kind of hinges on our ability to make sure that any kinds of new forms of regulation or legislation that we're bringing in keeps these workers at the front of our minds, because, you know, these companies have really done an incredible job, I think, of evading liability for these workers. And, you know, whether it's deaths on the road or terrible conditions and accidents in warehouses, these are the kinds of things that we shouldn't be wondering, can we hold these companies liable? It should be really clear, and I think that's the kind of future that we're looking forward to. But I'll stop there, Shauna.
Well, thank you so much, Thulsi, for explaining both just the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, like why we're so focused and emphasize this work and this sector, and for also talking about and introducing human rights due diligence, the role of corporations, corporate accountability when we're talking about the future of work in general. And so I would really like at this point to welcome Vaidehee. Vaidehee joined Aviva Investors last year after working at Share Action, and leads one of Aviva Investors' three thematic pillars. They have a social pillar, which she leads. They also have a pillar focuses on climate change and biodiversity. She works with investment teams across multiple asset classes to embed human and labor rights considerations into investment decision making. So Vaidehee is where the rubber hits the road on how investors are thinking about jumping in, playing a role here in the human rights due diligence and the future of work. So welcome, Vaidehee. I understand Aviva decided against investing in Deliveroo after the company went public earlier this year. And that was at least in part due to the known poor treatment of workers. And, you know, I'm just curious about that decision. And do you feel optimistic that investors can really be a good force for helping us, all of us collectively, build towards a just recovery coming out of the pandemic? Turning it over to you, Vaidehee.
Thank you so much, Shauna. And again, just to echo what everyone else has said, it's a total pleasure to be on a panel with such excellent speakers. You're all very privileged to hear from them, and it's no pressure on me as the last speaker. So I guess in answer to your question, Shauna, I suppose that it's fair to say that optimism comes in waves. So yes and no, I think is the short answer. But I suppose a useful way of answering the question more fully is to sort of reflect on what happened around the time of the IPO and what's happened or has continued to happen since then. So I think what happened with the Deliveroo IPO was important, certainly. So of course, it's very helpful to have investors cite workers' rights as a factor in their assessments of companies. the fact that that preceded what was the worst IPO in the history of the London Stock Exchange was also a powerful story in and of itself. And I think it shows also what can be done if investors are prepared to use their collective influence and voice to call companies out in public. But, and there was always a but coming, I think it's also important not to overstate what happened. Because then I think there's the risk of veering into complacency over what investors are or aren't doing. And so that's potentially also unhelpful. So I think it's important to understand that with the IPO, that was certainly an example of lots of different things coming together. So the investment case on Deliveroo was particularly weak. Many investors, I think, considered the company to be overvalued. There were concerns about the growth model in comparison to peers. There was also a concern around the dual class structure that would have meant investors had much less influence and power over the company. And then on top of that, of course, you had the concerns and the risks around employee reclassification. And those concerns were based on the employment models of the company. And in our view, that employment model was denying workers basic protections and rights. And I think I remember at the time Ruwan had tweeted on his epic Twitter feed something from the IPO prospectus for Deliveroo. And I think he said something like, "This reads like a charge sheet of all the laws that the company has broken around the world." And I think also referenced responsible investors and argued, how can a responsible investor ever consider investing in this company? And I think that was a reasonable challenge and charge to the investor community. And of course, investors shouldn't be facilitating, enabling these kinds of extractive employment models. They're socially and economically short-sighted. But I suppose the point is that there were a number of different factors that led to investors opting out of the IPO, and Labour considerations were one of those. And the reason I sort of emphasize that point is because I think it's important to be mindful of what's happened since the IPO. So, and that might give us some reasons to guard or catch our optimism, but also help us to think about what we need to do to kind of galvanize and push and pressure investors to think about these issues more seriously. So since the IPO, the share price for Deliveroo has recovered. It's now near or thereabouts the original IPO price. I think that says a lot about the way investors view the company. They've been certainly reassured by various things such as Delivery Hero buying a significant stake in the company, the UK Court of Appeals ruling that riders were self-employed, and that's all in spite of the evidence, the strikes, the massive investigation from the BIJ and the IWGB, the Bureau of Investigative Journalism and the Independent Workers Union, that showed that there were riders that were earning less than £2 an hour in some cases. So that's Deliveroo. And then I think beyond Deliveroo, I think it's important just to be aware that, and this won't be news to any of you, the gig economy is growing. And so I've seen, figures that suggest that the sector will grow or will have grown by 17 to 20% between 2018 and 2023. And most of that will be in transportation or asset sharing activities. So clearly, that's a massive growth opportunity for investors. And that's exactly why there are so many investors, including many of the investors that opted out of the Deliveroo IPO. I don't think that's a particularly revelatory thing to say, but that remain invested in companies, gig companies around the world. So companies like Uber, Glovo, Didi, DoorDash, companies that have been the subject of strike action in the last 12 months. So I think there are reasons to be optimistic for sure. Labour rights are being considered by investors when they assess companies in this sector, but they're certainly not being considered systematically as they should be.
Well, thank you for that, and I think it adds like another dimension for a room full of analysts and activists, a virtual room, who are working on these issues to think more systematically about how investors are actually supporting or not supporting employment models that are either advancing a dignified future of work or are not. And I think you've added a whole lot to the discussion with your comments here. I to thank the amazing panelists. I have like 8 or 9 questions for all of you, but time won't allow that. And we really want all of our participants today to have a chance to ask questions. And I see some are coming in the chat. So before I turn it over to my colleague, Chris, who is the chair of the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, to moderate the Q&A with our attendees today, I wanted to share just a short video. This video is a 1-minute teaser, and it kind of paints for a documentary. And that documentary we will be sending out to everyone from the Business and Human Rights Resource Center after the event today. This documentary and the 1-minute teaser you are about to see shows a story of food delivery workers in New York City who are right in the middle of all of the challenges that we heard our panelists describe today. And they have banded together and formed an organization, Los Deliveristas Unidos, and this documentary is about their struggle. So if we could play the 1-minute video.
Que vean de cómo es la vida de un delibrista afuera. No es fácil.
The customer is sitting at home using the app. They don't realize how difficult it is for delivery workers. The worker is putting their life at risk, and they are not getting even the minimum wage. They can die doing this job.
DoorDash, Relay, Uber, Postmate y Grofo exigimos también a las compañías que mejoren su sistema de trabajo.
Shauna, thank you for that intro and for carrying us through the panel so effectively. It's tough to lose Mary Robinson, but you've done fantastically in swapping in. And I want to thank all the panelists and all of the other folks who have joined us today. I am Chris Jochnick, chair of the Resource Center and also CEO of Lendesa. I spent a lot of time working on business and human rights issues in the past, but many of the points that have been made today are new to me, and it's been a fascinating discussion. So I'm going to jump right into the Q&A. I encourage folks to add some additional questions. I hope I can capture at least some of the more pertinent ones. Why don't we start with my former colleague, Rodrigo at Oxfam. He asks, and this should hopefully be a quick one, and Thulsi, maybe you could answer this. Is there a compendium of recent cases of gig workers winning collective bargains to extract learnings and inspire others? Does that exist? And if Thulsi, you don't know, maybe someone else can answer that one, and then we'll go from there.
Throwing me straight into it, Chris. Is there a compendium? I mean, our website in some ways serves as a little bit of a messy compendium in that we do kind of gather all of the informations about either allegations of abuse or organizing actions by workers themselves, and that's kind of organized by company, but I'm not sure if there are others that exist, but we will be sending around resources afterwards, and we'll certainly have a look for you. But I don't know if, oh yes, please, Ruwan.
Was there somebody else that wanted to answer that?
Yeah, Ruwan.
Ruwan?
Thanks very much, Chris. So we are actually in the process of preparing a compendium of collective bargaining agreements in this space. And I would also recommend colleagues to visit itfglobal.org, where we have a running commentary on the collective bargaining agreements that have been achieved in different countries. And I'd also, I can share in the chat a report put up by the International Lawyers Assisting Workers Network, the ILO network, on legal cases in this space, which documents the successes which have also led to collective bargaining agreements. So perhaps I can share both of those links in the chat. Thank you.
Ruwan, while I've got you, can you go on for a minute or two more? You mentioned some legal strategies, and maybe just more generally, how have you seen unions like the ITF change their advocacy tactics around gig workers, and particularly with the pandemic?
Yeah, thanks, John. I mean, I think we might not necessarily have changed our targets per se, but what we're focusing on is this business model. So every platform that operates in this space in many ways is a target, and the litigation strategies have proved to be very, very strong. So we're talking about union-led litigation here, mostly concerning employment cases, that is to determine employee worker status for the purpose of employment rights and collective bargaining, but also in issues like competition law, arbitration clauses, social protection, transfer policy, and data rights. Just this week, we saw unions in the United Kingdom, for example, take Uber to court over the alleged racist facial recognition software, right? So there's plenty of action in this space, and what we're seeing is a clear trend towards recognizing improved rights and employment status for drivers and riders in the world. And this is also leading to legislative change, political initiatives. So the trend is positive, but of course, we need to be cautious while being hopeful.
Great, thank you, Ruwan. Bama, lots of questions coming in that I think you could touch on, but maybe in particular, could you speak a minute about what new frameworks we need now to address some of these challenges?
Thanks so much, Chris. Yeah, I'd love to jump into that question. Something I've been thinking and writing a lot about is the fact that our supply chain oriented business and human rights frameworks are not fit for purpose in a digital economy. Just to make a few quick points on that, I want to stress that with the way platform algorithms work, they optimize, they take these big data sets, right? And they optimize the interests of the few over the interests of the many. And so we need collective ways to respond. To date, what I've seen from friends and allies in the digital rights space has been really very focused on individual privacy rights. That is certainly very important, but not on collectively what we as citizens, right? What is a data policy that actually brings about data justice, right? And digital justice look like? And we need a new digital justice framework, we really do. I think we need to stop thinking about the supply chain model of producers, right? In the old-fashioned way, and start thinking of every user as a producer. And so what would it mean collectively to protect all of the producers' rights in a digital platform if you use that new framework? I also think we need, coming back to worker rights, collective rights for workers' organizations to negotiate over the data sets and the code, the algorithms. And that's at the heart of that, set of lawsuits, the litigation strategies that Ruwan was just mentioning. If the algorithm is the one making the decisions, workers need the right to negotiate about that code. So let me leave it at that for now. I know there are lots of other questions coming in, but lots more to say on that topic. And I can see Ruwan nodding, so I think he's got a few things to say as well.
Thanks, Bama. And yes, I'm hoping we could get back to you with a few other questions. But let me go to Vaidehee with a question that's coming in from Elizabeth Umlas. So she asks, as an investor looking at the gig companies, what would stand out to really distinguish a good investor in this area? What could an investor do or a company do that would put them ahead of the field around workers' rights in the gig economy? If he's able to get unlocked.
Hey, yes. I think I caught the end of the question. I heard investor, so it sounds like that one's for me. I think
yeah, it was
one
for
of
you.
the,
Go ahead.
I think one of the biggest things from my perspective is to take, as we've discussed, is to take a rights-based approach. So, human rights due diligence provides the framework for any investor that wants to identify where it's most salient impacts are. So that means looking across portfolios, looking across the geographies that you're invested in and identifying where are those most damaging business models, where are they located, which are the companies, and what are they doing about them. At the moment, I feel like the investor community has looked at the gig economy and almost taken a sort of laid back approach to, oh, okay, well, we'll wait and see what the regulatory framework and the landscape does, how it evolves, and potentially maybe the valuations on these companies will capture that risk in time. So that's not really something for us to be overly concerned about. But I think that's sloppy and lazy. Actually, we already have the framework for managing human rights impacts, labor abuses, and it's now incumbent on investors to apply that in practice, rather than taking this sort of laid back approach that you've seen them take with the big tech giants in the past, and that hasn't really fared out particularly well. So I would prioritize taking a rights-based approach, and I think that will rub quite that will rub against some of the the growth imperative of many investors who are looking at some of these gig economy companies as a growth opportunity. And I think that's a discussion potentially for another day, but how can investors reconcile the need to pursue returns and pursue these enormous growth opportunities with these companies that have in some cases yet to turn a profit, against the need to balance the social considerations. So again, I think human rights due diligence is the basis upon which that approach should be taken.
And hopefully the mandatory due diligence laws will take investors into account. Let me go back to Ruwan with a question that comes in from Emilio. He talks about how companies have begun to call their workers associates to avoid being tied to them. And I'm wondering, Ruwan, is there some role for the unions, or he asks, is there a role post-recovery or during the recovery for unions to actually grow?
That's the $1 million question. Absolutely. And to the point about platforms calling their workers associates or partners, I mean, what we're witnessing is, the use of all types of fictional language to describe an employment relationship that really isn't, right? So what's really interesting about the Uber Supreme Court judgment in the United Kingdom is that the Supreme Court looked at the factual basis of that relationship between a driver and the platform. And what they concluded was that no amount of contractual fiction can change the fact that a worker relationship exists. So as far as we're concerned, you can call the workers partners, associates, or whatever you want to, but let's look at the facts, the factual basis of that relationship between worker and employer. And we have good guidance at the international level, and ILO recommendation 198, which shows how this can be operated in practice. So that's that. And moving beyond that question to the second piece on can unions grow? Absolutely. In the global trade union movement, we've been noticing, observing positive trends in growth during the pandemic, as there's been, so many layoffs, so many redundancies. Workers who did manage to keep their jobs or who are on furlough, we've seen a trend towards growth in membership, with workers realizing that for a just recovery, that collective power, collective strength is important. And we're not going to relent in our organizing activities come the end of the pandemic. So absolutely, we do see this as a massive opportunity for growth as we move towards a recovery phase.
Great, thank you. Bama, I want to come back to you because you've written about a feminist perspective on gig work. You talked a little bit about how women are discriminated against in the ratings. Can you talk a little bit more about what a feminist perspective would mean for gig workers? And although it's not necessarily related, there was a question that I think you might also touch on, which is how can we stop being products?
Okay, those are tough and big questions. And I think I want to come back a little bit to the point I made earlier about coercion, and I saw there was a question in the chat about that as well. And you know, the ways in which we might be facing a legal reality. So it's not even just about business and human rights framework, but employment law, broadly speaking, that doesn't know how to cope with the abuses when the decision to perpetrate the abuse or exploitation takes place, you know, veiled in code. And so that, you know, on discrimination, one of the points I've made is that the algorithms are trained to give you more of what you want. And so there have been now a number of exposés of the ways in which those algorithms are perpetuating employment discrimination, right? I mean, you know, I think one of the well noted examples is Facebook ads for jobs that intentionally only target men, right? Or only target women, because the algorithm thinks that, you know, no one wants to hire a woman for that job. So let's just send this ad to men. Now that's clearly, like, in the real world, right? In real life, we would consider that employment discrimination. But when Facebook has not actively, human beings in Facebook have not actively taken a decision to perpetuate discrimination, it's all just part of their code that no one sees. Our laws have a hard time dealing with that. That's gets back to my point on human trafficking as well. Like, when someone shows up to clean a house and the client has put in how big their house is and what they need done, and the platform has calculated that's going to take 4 hours. In reality, the cleaner gets there and it's going to take 8 hours. They're going to be doing 4 hours of forced labor, basically, you know, of unpaid labor. But the platform is not responsible. The platform data shows that she ought to be able to clean that house in 4 hours. So who's responsible for the coercion? Who's responsible for her 4 hours of forced labor? And so we really, this, you know, legally as well, is why we really need to rethink our employment laws to make them fit for purpose, to hold real people accountable for the decisions affecting individual workers that are made by algorithms. I don't think that answers all of the questions you just put to me, Chris, but I think I'll stop for now so that other people can answer questions.
That's great. Thank you, Bama. Vaidehee and Ruwan, I'm going to get to you, but I'm going to ask you to do a little homework. Can you look across the questions and figure out which one you would like to tap into, or think of your own final points? And I'm going to get to you in a moment. I'm going to start with Thulsi, though. Thulsi, there's a provocative question here about whether we should even be talking about gig workers when we have more urgent considerations from farm workers and factory workers. Why is the Resource Center putting time into gig workers now when we have so many other perhaps more worthy or urgent concerns?
Thank you for the very provocative question. It doesn't feel so provocative because it feels a little bit like there's an easy answer insofar as the fact that labor rights are labor rights, human rights are human rights. All workers deserve their rights, and it's really problematic, I think, to start getting into a hierarchy of which rights abuses are worse, and that's just not the kind of framework that we have. I think we do kind of look, you know, we have the luxury, I think, in some ways of being able to look at the kind of structural nature of labor rights abuses cross-sectorally. You know, we don't just look at kind of one sector, we look at workers as a whole through a corporate accountability lens to think about what is it that are driving these or permitting, you know, providing an environment that's kind of permittable for, you know, for these kinds of rights abuses. And what we do see is that our existing governance and regulatory framework disproportionately prioritizes the rights of companies over workers. And that's in every sector that we work in, you know, that whether it's kind of Amazon or Uber misclassifying their drivers and saying that they aren't direct employees, therefore minimizing their ability to be paid wages, minimizing their ability to collectively organize, putting women drivers in situations of harm and abuse. That isn't different to what happens to workers in factories or to workers on farms. That impunity of companies to be able to do that and get away with it, and that governance gap, that's universal. And I think that's really what it is that we're talking about when we look at all of these issues facing workers worldwide, is what is it that we can do, and what is our responsibility really, as you know, and this is for many of us, for many of you really in the audience today who are working on these issues, is what is the story that we're telling? Are we doing everything that we can to really hold these companies accountable and to consider what does accountability really mean? And I think that's really an important question, because we have talked a lot about due diligence. And I'm a little worried, you know, to be honest, about what do we mean by due diligence? You know, because the conversation that I think we really want to be having is about bridging the governance gap, about accountability, about liability of companies. And sometimes we get worried. I don't know if everyone in the resource center is going, oh gosh, do we? But, you know, I get worried that, you know, that the fallback of companies, because they're really used to being able to shape policies, they have incredible power over those processes. We don't want them to be in a position where they're saying, oh, you know, but we tried to check that, you know, nothing bad was happening and we did, and so that's us done. You know, we really need to be getting into the detail when we're looking at regulation. I hope that answered the question.
Absolutely. Thank you, Thulsi. Vaidehee, I'm going to actually dig into that due diligence piece, if you don't mind, wondering what that really implies for investors. Can investors really be held accountable for their investments in companies? That would be one question that I'd love you to answer, but if you'd rather, you can finish with any point you'd like to make.
I'll take that question, because I think the answer, my initial response would be yes, they absolutely should be held accountable. But what does that look like in practice? I don't think we have a clue right now, to Thulsi's point, right? So, you know, we've galvanized so much momentum and spirit behind introducing mandatory due diligence laws across various EU member states. The proposal will come out later this year. We hope that there will be some kind of liability mechanism. But then what happens, right? The law will be introduced, but then what does that, we still don't know. I think from an investor perspective, we still don't really know what we should be expecting companies to do yet. I think we're starting to, as a business and human rights community, flesh that out. But in terms of what we need investors to do, I think that piece is completely, has yet to begin. And that's the risk, I think. You know, I think there is a danger that we could leave it up to the investor community to interpret what this law means for them. Hopefully they're in scope, we're in scope. And then that's a real risk, because then we don't get to dealing with the issues that we're trying to address with this proposal. So I think there's a huge amount to be done, and I would hope that, you know, there are organizations working, you know, hopefully furiously to try and translate what this will mean for investors and really set it out, because there is a danger that it's left up to corporates and investors to interpret the law on their own.
Great, thank you. Ruwan, I want to turn to you. I promised you an open field, but actually I want to pin you down on one question that's come in about whether it's possible to push for global regulations and standards on the gig industry. Is that something that is on your radar, or is it too far-fetched? And you're welcome to end with any other final points.
Thank you, Chris. And that's really a great question. And that's very much on the radar of the global trade union movement. In fact, what we've been arguing for is for an ILO level instrument at the International Labour Organization, for a convention that regulates decent work for digital labor platforms. We've had the Global Commission on the Future of Work, which is chaired by the Prime Minister of South Africa and Sweden, also advocate for such an instrument modeled on the Maritime Labour Convention. Why? Because the global shipping industry is an industry made up of hundreds of actors across borders, and we have decent regulation at the global level. as Thulsi highlighted, there is a governance gap. There's a governance gap in international labor law when it comes to regulating platforms. So we do think there's a space for that. And that is something we're pushing at the ILO level. Similarly, in a couple of weeks, we'll be going back to the Human Rights Council for the 7th round of negotiations for the binding treaty on business and human rights, where digital work of this nature will, of course, feature as a key component as well. And in all of these spaces, we are fighting for proper, adequate human rights due diligence legislation based on 8 particular key demands that we have as a trade union movement. And I should just add here that, many of these platform companies and many of the investors, as Vaidehee also spoke about, are domiciled or operate in OECD countries. If we look at the OECD's M&E guidelines, the guidelines for multinationals, it actually calls for companies to not engage in disguised forms of employment. It actually warns against misclassification. So how are these companies adhering to the guidelines? How are investors looking at the guidelines? So I think if we consider that misclassification creates a human rights abyss for workers, that should put companies, investors, and all supply chain actors on notice to take action. And in order to hold them accountable, we do need global regulation. And to the colleague that asked the question, I hope they know that we're very much pushing for this at the moment, and we need everyone's support, including civil society.
Great, thank you so much, Ruwan. Bama, I wanted to come back to you with about 5 different questions, but I'm looking at the clock and I realize I have to turn it over to Phil. So please carry on your points through your podcast, and I hope you build your following through this panel and others. And I just want to thank the other panelists as well. Thulsi, Vaidehee, Ruwan, thank you so much for coming today and giving us so much insight into this critical and somewhat novel issue. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Phil, and I hope everyone will continue tweeting and keeping up to date with the latest from the Resource Center. Thanks, Phil. Oh, and we're going to share a link to Bama's podcast. Oh, someone's asked that question. So Bama, please send a link. Over to you, Phil.
Thanks very much, everybody. I'm just extraordinarily grateful to everybody who's allowed this to happen. I'm going to try and do a quick summary of what we've heard, because I think it's been extraordinary to hear. Firstly, about the transformed context in which so many workers are finding themselves each day, and the way that transformation of gig workers is so fundamentally linked now into pretty much every supply chain that we as consumers and as workers are somehow attached to. I mean, we started this podcast thinking about the gig economy as a litmus test of the just recovery. How were these essential workers of the pandemic, now being treated? And can we see significant progress in the way that their fundamental dignities and freedoms are being treated? Because the digitalized economy, as Bama put it, does, as we've heard, has profound impact on those fundamental dignities and freedoms that we all hold dear as a broad, diverse, human and global human rights movement. And they're the dignities and freedoms of workers, but as we've also heard, they affect all of us in terms of privacy and surveillance that's upon us. Now, we've heard this extraordinary change in context where, as we know, the digital economy has and is providing an extraordinary access to information that we all enjoy enormously. But it is also now building in the private spaces that algorithmic coercion and discrimination, which can fundamentally affect the life prospects and the enjoyment, the immediate enjoyment of life of so many people who are affected by it. That abuse veiled by code, as it was put, the hidden costs of workers' misclassification, where they absorb all the costs if they get ill by not taking holidays, by not achieving even a minimum wage. You know, £2 a day, £2 an hour in the UK is a quarter, less than a quarter of the minimum wage. So that gives you a sense of the scale of abuse that's even present in industrialized economies like ours, let alone the millions of gig workers that there are in so many emerging economies. I then want to just say a bit about the movements and strategies, because that was always the key thing that we wanted to create in this debate, was to look positively at what ways in which can we confront some of this transformation and redirect it towards shared prosperity, to shared security that we all hold dear and know is vital to our own open societies and our own freedoms and dignities. So I think firstly, what we've seen is, in terms of those movements and strategies, that this collective impact on rights demands a collective response to uphold our rights. And I think, you know, Bama expressed that very clearly in terms of that essential thing that many of us think from the human rights movement, privacy. It's very much a civil political right. It's therefore an individual right. And yet the impact of the codes and the algorithms is to effectively have a collective impact on us as a population, and to confront that and demand that that code delivers what we need from it, and those algorithms deliver what we need from them, because they're not probably going away. We have to also have that collective response. That what that demands from us is that we keep building our diverse and broad movement. As we also heard from Vaidehee, for instance, you know, when that IPO of Deliveroo happened, it was a broad movement that came together to confront that. And it was only through the action of workers, the legal system, and investors and many others that made that big difference. So again, I think we can see the importance of building unusual alliances, as well as really supporting and demonstrating solidarity with those who are on the front line of this. And that obviously is those gig workers who face so many areas of challenge and abuse. So supporting those legal struggles, supporting those disputes, supporting their demand for the fundamental freedoms of freedom of association and the right to collective bargaining, their fundamental right to a living wage. These things are absolutely vital. But linking those with investor actions, and as we've also heard, linking those also with demands for governments to step forward and start to play their much fuller role in ensuring that there is adequate regulation and business incentives that we need to make sure that this economy delivers that shared prosperity and that shared security. I think and in that, governments, as we've seen, have failed to do so on the tech giants. And we see now, with particularly the whistleblower out of Facebook, just the way in which that plays out to the disbenefit of all our societies everywhere in the world, because Facebook is everywhere. And so again, we've got the opportunity, at least at the moment, to press in on these gig these gig platforms, and ensure that governments get out ahead in terms of that regulatory and business incentive environment that they need to create. Human rights due diligence, human rights and environmental due diligence is going to be crucial to that process, as is access to remedy, that is also fundamentally important, and as we've seen, is already having some effect. So I remain, as was I think said by Ruwan, you know, we remain cautious but hopeful. There's been so much brought out from all this that I remain very much cautious but hopeful. And so I want to finish really just this by giving an enormous vote of thanks to those that have been so involved in preparing this. First of all, to you as the audience for coming and listening to what hopefully has been an insightful webinar for you that has opened new windows, new vistas on the way in which business and human rights as a movement needs to evolve, and evolve with the challenges that are out ahead of us. I want to obviously thank Mary. She was heartbroken that she couldn't be with us, but I was so grateful that she was able to send that video at extraordinarily short notice to make sure that she was present with us today. I want to thank Bama, because Bama really was the person who worked so closely, intimately with Thulsi to really develop the conceptual framework for this webinar. And I thank them both for that, and also Bama and Thulsi for being on the panel. I want to thank Ruwan, who we can see is extraordinarily busy fighting struggles around the world, for taking the time to be with us and sharing those extraordinary insights that he has. And also Vaidehee for her real frankness in coming here with that incredibly important investor perspective, that private sector perspective, and to come here and explain where there are real opportunities for us to cooperate together, and equally where there are real challenges that we need to keep pressing investors to do more with us to make the fundamental changes happen that are going to be necessary. Obviously, I want to thank also as you'll expect, the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre's team, and I think they're particularly, obviously, the communications team who's done so much. Pippa, Alex, David, Harriet, they've all made a fundamental difference, along with Priyanka. And then finally, the global team, particularly those in the regions that have got this out far and wide in terms of a webinar that's relevant to every place in the world. And our regional researchers and regional managers have done so much of that in the 20 locations where we are. So thanks very, very much. But finally, I want to thank Shauna and Chris as board members for the work that they've done in stepping in Mary's absence and making this such an extraordinary success. And finally, just again, thanks to you as an audience for coming. I hope it's been as insightful for you as it has been for me. Bye-bye.